Yes, this is what we're going to be doing today. We have three main parts to this presentation. There's a lot that we could say about the crucifixion of Christ, of course. There are many more details in the book than I can ever hope to cover. But what we're going to do in this first hour is talk about the events that led to the arrest of Christ. What was it that he was doing that made people so upset that they decided to put him to death? I mean, this is very hard for us to understand. As the Lord, we think he's wonderful, and we can't imagine wanting to put him to death, but that's not how first century Jewish leaders saw him. So that's what we're going to do first. And then in the second hour, we're going to take a look at the trials, the Jewish trial and the Roman trial. What happened there? What were the accusations? How was it that they found him guilty? What did they find him guilty of? And then lastly, in the third hour, I want to talk about some of the most famous prophecies and surprising prophecies that came true because of the crucifixion of Christ, okay? So let's start with Holy Week. Now, the church, Orthodox Church, is wonderful. It's so much, I can't begin to compare it to all the other churches. Compared to all the other churches, we have the richest, most complete cycle of services of Holy Week than anyone else. No one else does Holy Week the way we do. And the church not only prepares us for Holy Week by having Lent, it prepares us for Lent by the Triodion, So the church is very cognizant of the fact that we must constantly be preparing ourselves for whatever it is that comes next. So once we arrive at Holy Week, then we have to start thinking about what we need to do to prepare ourselves for the end of Holy Week, for the crucifixion. And the church prepares us for that by letting us know exactly what happened and why. So this, I think, is very important. The church is interested in the historical events of Christ's crucifixion. What happened and why? It gives us a historical context. Now, to compare that to others, the Protestants, of course, there's tens of thousands of different kinds of Protestants, but they give very little attention even to Good Friday. Mostly they remember Palm Sunday, then they jump over to Easter. There's really very little context for what happened to Christ on Great Friday. Catholics have Palm Sunday, which they also call Passion Sunday, because at the Mass of Palm Sunday, they read about the Passion of the Lord. They read about the crucifixion. So they jump from Sunday to Thursday. They have a 3-day Holy Week. They call it the Triduum. It's Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Only we have this incredible cycle of services. They're all different because they all tell us something about what's going on. And they explain it historically and theologically. So, the Gospels of early Holy Week tell us what was happening. Why did the Jewish leaders want to put Jesus to death? Now, in most of the Gospel readings that we hear, where we know the opponents of the Lord are the Pharisees and the scribes. So let's talk about them. The Pharisees are the ones who are the pickiest in terms of following the Jewish laws, what they call the law of Moses. Now, we think of the Ten Commandments, but that's not what the Bible means when it talks about the law or the law of Moses. There were 613 laws in the Old Testament. I should say there are 613 rules in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Pentateuch, is how we call it. 613 rules, but that's not enough. Over a period of time, over a period of about 1,200 years, from the time of Moses to the time of Jesus, different rabbis added more rules, and partly because the 613 rules in the Bible didn't address every single situation. So they would come to the rabbi and say, what about this? This isn't in the Bible. What do I do about that? So they developed a body of laws called the oral law. And it was called the oral law because it had never been written down. And there were thousands of rules that the Pharisees had invented, and they called it the oral law. And they believed it was just as binding, just as obligatory on every single Jew as the laws that were written down in the Bible. That was one of the main differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees said, no, we're not going to follow all your oral rules. But the largest number of teachers and leaders in first century Judaism were the Pharisees, and they believed in these thousands of oral regulations. Now, what problem do we have right away with something like that? Well, first of all, the problem is that they're never written down, so how do people even know about them? People who were either uneducated or didn't have the time to invest in many hours of studying these unwritten rules, how were they even going to know about them? For this reason, the rabbis and many of the more educated of the Pharisees, the rabbis and the Pharisees, these were the people who emphasized the law. They're not exactly the same. Pharisees are people who are insisting upon keeping all the minutiae of the law. A rabbi is just a teacher. That's what the word rabbi is. It means a teacher. So the rabbis and the Pharisees, the ones who excelled in following all of these rules, they tended to look down upon people who weren't keeping all of the rules of the law. So they tended to look down upon them and have disdain for them. And the people knew this because they said, actually, none of the people of the land, that means ordinary people, can hope to be saved. And in the Gospel of John, there's a verse where this is expressed. The people of the land, that means the ordinary people, are cursed. That's how they thought of them. So they were very self-righteous. They were very condemnatory of ordinary people. So what is it about Jesus that made those Jewish leaders so upset? Well, first of all, he was breaking many of the laws that they had created that they were promoting. Like he was healing on the Sabbath, as you know. They said, well, this is work. You're not allowed to do that. Well, guess what? That's not in the Bible. In the Bible, it says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. You're not supposed to work. But is healing somebody considered work? They had decided that it was. So Jesus was breaking that law. What else? He was associating with people that were called sinners and tax collectors and people that were unclean under the law of Moses. This made him unclean himself and also made him a very bad example because Jesus was a rabbi. That means that he was supposed to give a good example, not a bad example. So he wasn't concerned about ritual purity. Now, when Jesus would be invited to somebody's house, like the house of a tax collector, like Zacchaeus, first of all, they would consider him to be unclean just by walking into his house. That would make him defiled. But then, if he would eat with these people, they would eat out of a common dish in the center of the table. So there was a very strong sense of intimacy, of association. So it was a very bad example that Jesus was setting by eating with tax collectors and sinners. And what else? He touched lepers when he healed them. He touched dead bodies when he brought people back to life. All of this was considered defiling, and Jesus did not run off to the temple to ritually cleanse himself. Now, why didn't the Jewish leaders just ignore Jesus? Why didn't they just leave him alone? Because he was a threat. The crowds loved him. So, they were not able to get the kinds of crowds that Jesus got. There was a lot of jealousy there too. Now, sometimes when there are not a lot of people at church, we like to say, well, Jesus only had 12 disciples. But that's not true. Jesus had thousands of followers, thousands of disciples. People came to see him from all over the region with their sick. Wouldn't you, if you had somebody in your family who was sick or blind or paralyzed, you would find a way to get them to see Jesus with the hopes of being cured. And of course, he cured every single person that he touched. And even those he didn't touch, right, from far away. So Jesus had many, many followers, and he had a charisma, and he had a love of people, genuine love and concern for people that the Pharisees and many of the rabbis really didn't have, because they were so determined to simply make sure that they were following the rules of the laws of Moses. So the people realized that Jesus must be the Messiah. If not the Messiah, at least a great prophet. Now, how did they know that Jesus was the Messiah? Why would they think that Jesus was the Messiah, but other people, the educated people, did not? Well, they would go to the synagogue on the Saturdays for synagogue services. They would hear the prophecies being read. They heard these prophecies for their whole lives. And they realized that Jesus was fulfilling these prophecies. No one had done anything like that before he came along, and no one has done anything like what Jesus did since. What were the prophecies? Among them were the prophecies that the Messiah would give sight to the blind, and the lame would walk, and the deaf would hear. All of these things, that's not something you can fake. It's easy for somebody to say, I'm the Messiah. But can you do that? Can anybody do what Jesus did? Nobody. That's why people really didn't claim to be the Messiah very often. After the time of Christ, about 100 years later, there was a man who claimed to be the Messiah, who led the Jews in a revolt. His name was Simon Bar Kokhba, and of course, the revolt failed. After that, there were a few instances where somebody claimed to be the Messiah, but they never did anything like what Jesus did. So, because the people knew what to look for, because the prophecies foretold what the Messiah would be like, this is why the ordinary people recognized who he was. But the very learned people, they said, no, this guy can't be the Messiah. Why not? Because he's breaking the laws of Moses. He's working on the Sabbath by healing people. He associates with tax collectors and sinners. He touches defiled things. He says that it doesn't matter what goes into your mouth. That's not what defiles you. It's what is in your heart that defiles you. Can you imagine saying that to somebody? So they thought this guy cannot be the Messiah. Why else might they think he can't be the Messiah? He's from Galilee. He's from Nazareth, a nothing of a town. At least maybe if he was born in Jerusalem, comes from an upstanding, prominent family, maybe if he had an education. Jesus had no rabbinic education at all. He never studied under any rabbi. So as far as they were concerned, he's no good. He's not a good rabbi. He's a bad example, and he can't be the Messiah. But there was one little problem they had to account for, and what is that? What do you think? The miracles. How do you explain all of those miracles? Day after day after day after day, Jesus healing scores of people, hundreds of people, thousands of people. Every day people came to him. How do you explain that? Well, there's only two ways to explain power. They had to recognize that Jesus had real power. What kind of power? Power can only come, spiritual power can only come from two sources, God or the devil. So they said, well, he can't get his power from God, because if he was really from God, He would be keeping all of the laws that we created. The laws, the oral laws. He would be keeping all of those. He would be the Messiah would keep the laws better than anybody else. So this can't come from God. It never occurs to them that there might be something wrong with their laws. Instead, they said, he can't be the Messiah. He can't get his power from God because he's breaking the laws of Moses. Therefore, he must get his power from the devil. And this is what we see in the Gospels, okay? Now, why not assume possibly, maybe, could we be wrong? Could we be wrong? Maybe what we're expecting the Messiah to be is something else. Maybe the Messiah, our expectations are not correct. Is that a possibility? Why did they assume that God, I'm talking about the Jewish leaders, not all the Jews, just the Jewish leaders, why would they assume that God would agree with them that Jesus is not of God, that he's from the devil, or he's a liar, he's a charlatan, he's fake, something like this? Why did they agree that Jesus must be of the devil and not be from God? Well, because they were the people in charge. The Jewish leaders and all of Judaism, even today, there's a kind of mentality in the Jewish scriptures. It's called by scholars Deuteronomistic thinking. And this is a belief that if a person is wealthy, prominent, respected, has many children, good health, this kind of a thing, many blessings of God, it's because God has blessed this person, because God approves of them, because they are righteous. We call that Deuteronomistic thinking. It comes from blessings that Moses proclaimed at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Let me say that again. So if you are wealthy, have many children, good health, you're prominent, you're respected, etc., you are de facto a good person. You have those things because God has blessed you because you are righteous. Now, conversely, if you are poor, childless, uneducated, have some kind of an illness, you're suffering because God has cursed you. God is punishing you for some reason. That's the mentality. Now, how does that affect our story? The Jewish leaders presume that they are right because they're the ones in power. They're the ones who have authority in Judaism. They're the ones who are respected and wealthy and powerful. Therefore, God agrees with them. And that means Jesus, who is poor, uneducated, from a little hick town that nobody cares a thing about, that he can't be the Messiah. They have decided that, you see. So, at any rate, they decided he has to go. Now, you all know about the scribes and the Pharisees. The Pharisees we mentioned, they're the ones who try to follow every single requirement of the law. What about the scribes? Now, when we say the word scribe, we tend to think of people who are copyists. That's not what a scribe is in the Bible. You have to remember that. You can use the word scribe any other place, and that means a copyist. Not in the Gospels. A scribe is a person who is an expert in the laws of Moses, especially those unwritten laws, and there were thousands of them. So a scribe would spend years and years memorizing the thousands of oral rules that had developed over the centuries, and not only the rules themselves, but their interpretation. All the famous rabbis, what they commented on, what they said about these rules. That's the oral law. A scribe spent years memorizing these things. They were like little walking legal encyclopedias. And they were highly respected. Do you think people respected the Pharisees? Absolutely. They thought, wow, that person they're really close to God because they keep all of these rules. The same thing with the scribes. The scribes kept all the rules and they knew all of those rules. They spent years studying them, and they wore a special mantle. You know, that big long piece of fabric in the Bible pictures that they wrap around, that hangs down around the shoulder. That mantle had a long fringe, and you could easily tell a scribe by looking at them. And when a scribe passed by, if you were sitting at a workbench, you stood up out of respect for the scribe. So these people were highly respected, highly educated, and Jesus said what about them? Hypocrites. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. Wow. They didn't like that. They weren't used to people criticizing them, calling out the fact that outwardly, in terms of the laws of Moses, they were perfect and they were clean, but inside they were corrupt. He said, you are like whitewashed tombs. Outside you look nice and clean. Inside you're full of all kinds of corruption. They were greedy and they were hypocritical, and they lacked love and mercy and compassion. They didn't really care that much for the ordinary person. So they were not happy with what Jesus had to say about them. And this is one of the things that gets him into trouble. Now, they're not the ones, however, who arrest the Lord. He gets arrested when he goes to Jerusalem. We see lots of plots against Christ in Galilee, where the Pharisees and the scribes are the strongest. But the Lord gets arrested when he goes to Jerusalem. And the main actors involved in making sure that the Lord is arrested and put to death in Jerusalem are the chief priests. They're the ones who become especially concerned. Now, the Pharisees and the scribes, they don't like the fact that Jesus criticizes them, points out their hypocrisy, but he's not really a threat to them. But in Jerusalem, Jesus becomes a big threat. So, let's talk about some of the catalysts. Now, what do we see in the gospel readings of early Holy Week? If you don't come to church every night, if you don't usually, during Holy Week, you've got to start doing that. Every single night of Holy Week. Don't just come on Palm Sunday and then Thursday or Friday. Come on Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night. Go through the cycle of services, because the readings tell us exactly what's happening. So in the gospel readings of early Holy Week, we see Jesus clashing with the scribes and the Pharisees. And when I tell you the stories, remind you about the stories, you're going to remember right away. So let's start with what happens first. They begin to challenge him. Now, the disciples of the Pharisees come to Jesus with a question, not the Pharisees themselves. They've tried to trick Jesus many times, unsuccessfully. So now they send their disciples to Jesus to ask him a question. They hope he will say the wrong thing. They can report him to the Romans, get Jesus into trouble. And that's the question about whether we should pay tribute to Caesar. Rabbi, is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar? That's a rabbinic question. Because when you give the coin tribute, this is the tribute coin. In other words, the Romans were their occupiers. They had to pay a head tax. Every single Jewish man had to pay a tax to Caesar as the occupier. And doing so was like recognizing that he's really the king. Now, God is supposed to be your king. So theoretically, if you pay the tax, you're recognizing that Caesar is king, and therefore you're committing blasphemy. Now, they had to pay it. There was no way around it. But the question was, is it lawful? Okay, is it correct? Is it appropriate? So what does Jesus say? And it's not the Pharisees, but their disciples. Before they begin to even ask the question, they try to butter Jesus up. They say, Master, we know that you aren't concerned about anyone's opinion. You believe in telling the truth. They're hoping to relax him and flatter him in saying the wrong thing. So tell us what you think. They don't really care about his opinion, and he knows it. So he says, hypocrites, show me the tribute, the coin of the tribute. And the coin has the image of Tiberius Caesar. Whose image is on the coin? Oh, Caesar's. Whose name is on the coin? Caesar's. Well, then render back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God. They thought he had to answer yes or no. If he said yes, it's lawful, then he's basically a blasphemer. If he says no, then they could report him to Caesar as a Jewish leader who was opposed to the tax. That was considered a very serious crime. Whole cities had been burnt to the ground for refusing to pay taxes. It was a very serious thing. So he realizes what they're doing, and he stops them short. Then the Sadducees ask him that question about the woman married to 7 different brothers. They're just trying to make Jesus look foolish. He answers that question. Then a scribe asks him, what is the greatest commandment of the law? And he answers this question. Then he asks them, Jesus turns the tables and asks them a question. The Messiah, whose son is he? They said, son of David. He says, then how is it that David, speaking in the Spirit, calls the Messiah my Lord? When he's quoting a psalm where David wrote this psalm and said, my Lord, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at your right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. That was recognized as a messianic psalm, a psalm that foretells the coming of the Messiah. Why would David call the Messiah my Lord? You have to understand, what does he mean by this? First of all, the Messiah is called Son of David because he's going to come and restore the kingdom of David. He's famous because of David. David is the more important one. The Messiah comes along later. He's redoing or restoring what David started. So it's like saying if President Obama was to come here, that would be a big deal. But if his daughter, one of his daughters were to come here, she would be welcome. This is the daughter of President Obama, right? Or President Biden, or whoever it is. In other words, that person is famous, not so much in their own right, but they're especially famous because of who their father is, right? Who's more important, the father or the child? The father. Okay? So when Jesus says, why is it that David calls the Messiah my Lord? In Greek, it's Kyrios, and in Hebrew, it's Adonai, which is a divine title. They didn't know what to say to that. In other words, the son of David, the Messiah, will be greater than David, and not just a mere human being, but the Lord. They didn't know what to say to that. So they went away and they didn't ask him any questions. But after that exchange, during Holy Week, we see other stories in which Jesus brings on a confrontation with these Jewish leaders. Let's talk about that. There are 3 main catalysts to the arrest of Jesus. The first is the raising of Lazarus. That's so important. Do you know that the early church remembered the raising of Lazarus? The early church celebrated the raising of Lazarus. It's so important. No one else has it. Neither Protestants nor Catholics remember the raising of Lazarus. It's very important because our church is trying to put all of these events into a historical context. And it tells us in the Gospel of John that the raising of Lazarus is the reason why Jesus was welcomed into Jerusalem by a big crowd on Palm Sunday. So it's very important. But what was so important, what was so different about the raising of Lazarus? Jesus had done thousands of signs. There are so many miracles we'll never know about. The Gospels only contain a very small number of miracles. Thousands and thousands of miracles. And Jesus raised a lot of people from the dead. We know of at least two. Jairus' daughter, the little girl who was 12 years old, and the son of the widow of Nain. Both of those had died very recently. When people died, they were buried almost immediately, within a few hours. So think about the time when Jesus raised this little girl. Remember, he's told that this little girl is dying. So he decides to go. And on the way, this woman with an issue of blood thinks, if I just touch the fringe of his garment, I'll be healed. Remember that? Okay, so he continues on his way, gets to the house, the little girl has already died. Everybody's screaming and hollering. And he says, don't mourn, she's just sleeping. Because she had just died an hour or two before. So they bring her out alive. So people would have thought, well, maybe she really was just sleeping. So in the case of Lazarus, he had been dead for 4 days. He was deader than dead can be. The body had already started to decay. And the Jews had a tradition. They believed that the soul stayed with the body for 3 days. The soul couldn't stand to be parted from the body. But on the 4th day, it saw that the body was decaying, so the soul would leave, never to return. There was no coming back if you've been dead for 4 days. We would say the same thing today, right? It's one thing if maybe they can revive you if you've just died. Maybe if the body was cold enough, you sort of suspend your suspended animation. You can bring somebody back from the dead, even if they've been without breath for half an hour. That can happen. But not for 4 days. And yet, when Jesus goes to Bethany and raises Lazarus from the dead, the people who were there with the sisters, they had been at the funeral 4 days before. They were part of the village. They had prepared the body. They had wrapped him up. They had carried him on the bier. They had taken him to the cemetery. They put him in the tomb and shut the door. They knew he was dead, and they knew exactly when that happened, 4 days ago. And when Jesus stands there and says, Lazarus, come forth, and he comes out, that's amazing. That's something nobody expected, because it's impossible. Could not come back from the dead after 4 days. And yet there were so many witnesses to this. Some of them went back to Bethany with Mary and Martha, but other people went to Jerusalem to report it to the chief priests and the Sanhedrin. And they said, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? This man does too many signs. They didn't say, maybe we should rethink this. Maybe he's the Messiah. No, this man does too many signs. A sign is a miracle. What are we going to do about him? Oh, everybody's going to follow him. What should we do? So, this is when Caiaphas says, you don't understand how serious this is. He has to die. It's better for one man to die than for the whole nation to be destroyed. But why would the whole nation be destroyed? Why? Because if Jesus started a revolt, this could lead to a war against Rome, and this would mean the destruction of the nation and the temple. Now, they didn't know that Jesus didn't have political ambitions. As far as they were concerned, he probably did. But that was their concern. So they made a resolution. He has to die, and he has to die before Passover. Why? Because at Passover, the normal population of the city, which was about 50,000, maybe 60,000 people, swelled to 200,000, 250,000 people. And when you have a very small space with a lot of people crammed into it, and a lot of religious enthusiasm mixed with political ambitions and hopes, you have a potential for having a revolution. So they decided he has to die before Passover. This is what John's Gospel tells us. They resolved. They were determined. Okay. They just didn't know how they were going to do it, because they had decided before he needed to die, or at least he would be arrested. They were never able to carry it off. They were never able to pull it off. Jesus would slip into the crowd and disappear, or they sent some temple guards to arrest him, and they said, "We can't arrest him. Nobody ever spoke like this man." Or they picked up stones, and then they weren't able to do anything about it. So they've never been able to pull off an arrest. We'll come back to that later. So first we have the raising of Lazarus. On the day that we remember as Palm Sunday, Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and he's welcomed by these massive crowds who were shouting for him, "Hosanna, Son of David." That's a messianic title. "Hosanna, King of Israel." Messianic. "Blessed is the one who comes." That's a messianic title. We don't think of it. It doesn't sound messianic. But if you think about how many centuries the Jewish people were waiting for the Messiah, they started calling him the coming one, the one who is to come. So when people said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," that's a messianic title. So Jesus is hailed as a conquering hero, welcomed into Jerusalem with palm branches and red carpet royal treatment and all the rest. And the Sanhedrin sees this and they say, "We were right, this guy has got to go. Look, the whole world is going after him. What are we going to do about him?" Now they decided he has to die, but they weren't sure how they were going to pull it off. After he enters Jerusalem, Jesus goes to the temple and cleanses the temple. That's what we call it. They would have called it making a mess of the temple, right? Because he takes the tables with the money changers and he overturns them and sends out all the sacrificial animals, and all this makes a whip. He makes a big fuss. What's that about? That is the third catalyst. The first catalyst is the raising of Lazarus. The second catalyst is the entry into Jerusalem. The third catalyst, and the most serious one, is the cleansing of the temple. This event is told in all four Gospels because it is so important. We don't understand it. We think, oh, Jesus got mad, had a little fit, had a hissy fit, right? No. Jesus had been going to the temple multiple times a year his whole life. It's not like suddenly he realized they're selling things at the temple. No, this was a specific prophetic act. It's an act which he knew would get him the wrong kind of attention, but he was making a statement. All right, let's begin by talking about why this was such a serious statement, that it warranted his death, because this is the charge that's brought against him at his Jewish trial. It's all about the cleansing of the temple. First of all, we have to understand what the temple was. We think of maybe a big church like this as a large church. You have a very large and beautiful complex here, but this is nothing compared to the size of the temple at Jerusalem. It was the only Jewish temple in the entire world, and it was the only place where animal sacrifice could be offered, and that was required by the law of Moses. And it was the place where people said God dwelt. God physically, in a real sense, was with his people in the Holy of Holies at the temple in Jerusalem. It was the center of Jewish faith and life. There was no place on earth where you were closer to God, where you were closer to heaven than the temple. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of synagogues around the world, but they didn't offer animal sacrifice. The synagogue was a place of prayer, sermon, you could sing psalms, but not like the temple. The temple was the presence of God on earth. It had massive courtyards, exterior courtyards, because we think about sacrificing animals. We don't really think about how bloody and messy it was. And after they sacrificed the animals, usually they burnt them or burnt parts of them. And this is why altars were in a big open space. when you first enter the temple courts proper, and only religiously pure Jews could enter the temple courts, the first massive court you entered was called the Court of the Women. It was square, but it would have been bigger than this space here. And it would have been rimmed around on three sides by massive colonnades, and there were balconies above. People would be down below in this big courtyard, and above in these big balconies. And within this massive courtyard called the Court of the Women, because women could enter there, there were four massive lanterns that could be burnt at night. Massive, massive lanterns with gigantic bowls. After the Court of the Women, and by the way, along the sides of all these courtyards, there were smaller rooms, because you're talking about a huge complex, the only temple for all of the Jews around the world. By the way, the temple complex itself took 25% of the land of Jerusalem. That's how big it was. It was huge. And Herod the Great had enlarged it and beautified it, and etc. There was a big courtyard outside called the Court of the Gentiles that had a massive colonnade that ran on three sides of the mountain, a double colonnade, what they called a portico, that was covered with beautiful wood that was carved, cedar wood. And under these double porticos, they made this you know what a paseo is like. We have these kind of covered colonnade areas. These were double colonnades, massive white columns all the way around the temple. This is where Jesus would teach and other rabbis would teach. But once you entered into the sacred space, like the Court of the Women, this is where you began to see these very sacred activities take place. Beyond the Court of the Women, there were 17 steps in a semicircular, sort of half circles. You walked up those steps, and then you would be inside the Court of Israel, but it was long and narrow. And in the Court of Israel, this is where a man could bring, only men could enter there, an animal for sacrifice. And he would hand it over to a priest who stood on the other side of a low wall. Now, on the other side of the low wall was called the Court of the Priests. Again, it was a huge area with, on the right, there was an area with hooks and marble tables where animals were slaughtered and their blood was drained from the neck, and that blood was thrown when the animal was sacrificed at the base of the altar. And then there was a massive altar that stood 25 feet tall, and it was 50 feet square. It was huge, and it had lots of different sacrifices burning on it, and the priests would walk around the perimeter tending to all the sacrifices. But it was huge. Beyond that was an enclosed building, and as I said, these are courtyards because they were open to the sky. Beyond that was an enclosed building, the holy place. And after the holy place, the Holy of Holies. The holy place was completely covered in gold. If you were to face it, it looked like a cube, but it was 17 stories high, completely in an enclosed building, completely covered in gold, the thickness of a coin. And in front of it were 4 massive columns, also 17 stories high, of the finest white marble. Now, to enter into this Holy of Holies, again, you had to ascend 12 steps. And then in between the second and third column was another set of 4 columns, only 60 feet high, pure white, but embellished with gold, with a gold grapes and grapevine, pure gold. The grapes, the bunches of grapes that hung down over the mantle over the lintel of this doorway were 6 feet high. And then there were these grapevines and tendrils that wrapped around these white columns. It was magnificent. If you looked at it when the sun was shining, because it's covered in gold, you couldn't look at it. It would blind you. It was blinding. And this is why, and everything was white gold and stibium, which is a silvery stone, white marble, alabaster, silver stone, and gold. And as I said, it's massive. Now that's not even to mention all the gold and silver covered doors, all of the gold utensils. There were over 90 of them, golden bowls, a massive gold menorah 6 feet high, a massive solid gold altar on which incense was burnt every day. You're talking about wealth, opulence beyond the ability to even explain. When the disciples were looking at the temple from the other side of the Kidron Valley, from the Mount of Olives, you can sit and see Jerusalem on the other side of this deep gorge called the Kidron Valley. They said, "Look, Lord, look at how beautiful the temple is." And he said, "I tell you, there will not be left one stone upon another." And that's exactly what happened. When the temple was destroyed in the year 70, as you see, the Jews revolted against the Romans. Those zealots finally got their way. They started a war. They revolted against the Romans. And the Romans came and they besieged Jerusalem for 3 years. It's absolutely horrific what happened to the people who were inside. But eventually, they got into the city, and then all the Jews inside the city went up to the Temple Mount and they barricaded themselves inside the temple. And the Romans got in there too. And a fire started. And all of that gold melted in the fire. And it ran through the cracks of the stones. We're talking about massive stones. Some of them is the size of a city bus. We're talking about huge. The engineering involved was incredible. And there was a temple treasury that also had huge quantities of gold and silver coins, so much that they didn't even know how much money they had. They couldn't even count it. But this is exactly what happened. So after the temple caught fire and burned, all of that gold melted, and for a long time people went and scavenged the site. And in order to get the gold that melted and ran through the cracks, they took all the stones apart, so that today there's nothing left of the temple at all. But the temple was the place of, what we would say, not only the focus of worship for the Jewish people, the place where God dwelt, but it was the place where the chief priests and the high priests had and received their power, their authority, and their wealth. There were between 10 and 18,000 ordinary priests. These are the usual guys like Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, who would go and help with the services and the sacrifices. But above them, there was a hierarchy called the chief priests. And those people, the chief priests, ran the whole operation. And you can imagine how much money they had access to. They were extremely corrupt, and they benefited from their position at the temple. There were a lot of jobs that had to be done at the temple. You had to procure wood and incense and silk for the garments of the high priest, and animals, everything that had to be bought and sold. All of this required a lot of money and a lot of influence. And this is how they maintained their power and their money and their influence. They lived lives of great opulence and great luxury because of their control over the temple. Now Jesus comes, having been hailed as the Messiah, comes to Jerusalem, overturns the tables of the money changers, who, by the way, part of their cut goes to those chief priests. The people who are selling animals, do you think that this is just done They keep all the profit? Of course not. Some of that money goes to the pockets of the chief priests. They're the ones who decide who gets to set up shop on the temple courtyards, right? So Jesus comes and says, you have made my Father's house a den of thieves. And they were worried. Because even though he's a country bumpkin with no education from Nazareth, he has a huge following. Thousands and thousands of people believe he's the Messiah. So they decide he has to go. So one of the things that they do, the next day, he's teaching in front of a group of people there on the Temple Mount, and they ask him a question. By what authority do you do these things? He says, I'm going to ask you a question. By what authority did John baptize? Did he get his authority from men or from God? They didn't want to answer. They didn't believe in John. So they said, but they were afraid to say so. So they said, we don't know. He says, and I'm not going to answer. But as these Jewish leaders, now we're talking about the chief priests, the people who run the show in Jerusalem, as they're standing there, Jesus begins to tell a parable, and these parables are told in the gospel readings of early Holy Week. There's a parable of two sons. The father says to the first son, son, go to the vineyard and work there today in the vineyard. And the son says, no, I'm not going. But later he changes his mind and he goes. But then the father says to a second son, son, go today and work in the vineyard. And the son says, okay, father, but he doesn't go. Which one did his father's will? The first son. Even though he said no, later he went. Who does that represent? The Gentiles or the sinners who repented? Who are the ones who say yes to God, but don't do what he says? Them, the chief priests. They knew he was talking about them. But he's saying this in a story form in front of the crowd. And then he tells them another parable that we also read in the early nights of Holy Week. There was a man who planted a vineyard. He built a hedge around it, built a watchtower, and then he lent it out to tenants. And when the time for the harvest came, when he should be paid his rent, he sent his servants to collect the rents. And they beat them up and sent them away. And then he sent another servant, and they treated him shamefully and beat him and sent him away. Another servant. Finally he says, I will send my son. They will respect my son. But they see the son and they say, this is the heir, let us kill him. And they cast him out and they kill him out of the vineyard. It tells us in the Gospels that the Jewish leaders knew that Jesus was talking about them. Believe me, they did not appreciate that. But these are the kinds of things that he said that made them very upset. He said, have you never heard where it says in the scriptures, the stone that was rejected by the builders was the most important stone. It turned out to be the cornerstone. This has been done by the Lord, and it is wonderful in our eyes. Okay? Now, when they confronted him for cleansing the temple, they said, by what authority do you do this? And he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. And they said, it's taken 46 years to build this temple. Herod the Great had started an improvement project 46 years before. It continued for another 30 years. The temple was completed just before it was destroyed by the Romans. They realized he couldn't be talking about the physical temple, but they didn't really understand what he meant by this. But he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. What's the temple? John tells us the temple is his body, right? That they were planning to destroy. Why does he call his body the temple? Because the physical temple, the building, was the presence of God on earth. But now God himself is present and was on earth. That's what he was saying. They were determined to destroy him. They thought he was a threat to the physical temple, the buildings, but the real presence of God on earth was in the person of Jesus Christ. So at this point, let's take a break for a few minutes. And when we return, we'll talk very briefly about Judas and the arrest of Jesus, and then the 2 trials, okay? So stand up and take a little break. Okay, let's continue. I'm just going to be able to have only enough time to give you some highlights. Just a few highlights. Well, we can start with the arrest. We'll talk about Judas first, because everybody seems very fascinated by Judas. What do we know about him? Practically nothing. But his name, Iscariot, has created a lot of discussion. What does that mean, Iscariot, Iscariotes? The problem is we can never know for certain why he has this term Iscariot, because that is written down in Greek, and we don't know for sure what the Aramaic word was that was rendered into Greek as Iscariot. And it could be a number of things that kind of come close. Well, there was a little town in Judea called Kerioth. So it could simply mean that he's a man from Kerioth. That's not very interesting, right? There are some words that sound in Aramaic like Iscariot that mean the red. It could be physical characteristic, maybe a reddish complexion or reddish hair. Or it also sounds very much like an Aramaic word for dyer, person who dyes cloth. One of the ones that's been kind of consistently reported and sort of got some traction, which most people have heard of, is that it sounds a lot like Sicarii, and the Sicarii were a group of rebels, like zealots, who rebelled against Rome, and because they carried little daggers and in their their waistband, and they used to murder Roman soldiers and also wealthy Jews whom they knew were cooperating with the Romans. This is how the Romans were able to manage the huge territory as the Roman Empire was. They had to cooperate with the local sort of aristocrats of the region. That's how they were able to maintain control. So they got the aristocrats, they were able to keep their position, their money, their power, as long as they obeyed Rome. And everybody knew this. So it was very corrupt. Ordinary aristocrats didn't really care at all about average, ordinary people who were struggling just to survive. Instead, they were working very closely with the Romans to keep the people down. So the Sicarii were a group of revolutionaries. Now, that's probably not it, but everybody likes that one because it seems to be kind of romantic and suggests that maybe Judas was a disillusioned revolutionary and that kind of a thing. It's the least likely because it's the farthest away in sound from Iscariot. There's one other possibility. The word Iscariot sounds a lot like the Aramaic word for false one. Is Iscariot a way that the disciples came to refer to Judas after he betrayed the Lord? He was a false disciple, was never really a true disciple. That's a possibility. But they have to refer to him somehow because there was another one of the 12 who had the name Judas. So that's why they always have to call this other one the Iscariot, okay? But we can't say exactly why he has that name. Why did he betray Christ? What does the scripture say? For money. It's hard for us to imagine. That is the most crass motive, but that's the reason why most people do most things. It's for money, okay? Now, was Judas necessary? We have to be very careful, theologically speaking, when we answer this question, was Judas necessary for the crucifixion, for the plan of salvation? Nobody wants to answer. You're being very wise. The answer is no. If Judas was necessary, he would be part of our salvation. No. What Judas does is he makes it easier for Jesus to be arrested. Remember, they had already decided to arrest him. They just didn't know how to get around the crowds. They didn't know how they were going to arrest him without, a lot of people getting upset about it. So Judas doesn't make the arrest of Jesus possible. He just makes it a lot easier because he takes the Jewish leaders to where Jesus is in the middle of the night so he can be arrested, put on trial, and by Friday morning, he's already standing before Pilate. So he doesn't make it necessary. He's not necessary. He just makes it easier. Did he repent? Depends on what word you use. He seems to have had remorse, but he did not repent because that word is not used. In other words, he is sorry, he made a mistake. Why did he suddenly seem to realize what happened? Well, Chrysostom tells us that it's very interesting that the devil prevents us from seeing the wrong that we're doing while we're doing it. Then afterwards, he prevents our repentance, or he leads us to despair. And that's exactly what happened with Judas. Now, some people think, well, Judas is necessary. It had to happen because of the prophecy, right? And so when people say, well, Judas was necessary because the prophecy had to be fulfilled. We hear about that all the time, right? But it's very important that you understand how prophecy works. It isn't that Judas had to betray Christ because of the prophecy. Because if you say he had to, then he's without any guilt or any sin. He doesn't have free will. But we don't believe that. Judas had free will to choose to betray Christ or not. He had to have free will. Now, somebody told me she was raised in a Protestant church, and she was taught that Judas was born for this very purpose, to betray Christ and go to hell. I said, how can anyone even imagine such a thing? God doesn't want any one of us to go to hell. And Christ, just think about this. Why did he even choose Judas to be one of the 12? Why? Why did he choose Judas to be the treasurer of the group? He handled the money. If he knew that Judas was a thief and an embezzler, because he was, John's gospel tells us that. You see, it's quite different how the Lord thinks and how we think. Let's start off by saying, let's talk about prophecy. A prophecy is made because the prophet sees into the future what will happen and tells you. He doesn't cause the event to happen. He just knows it's going to happen. Now, a lot of you here are moms. You know your kids. You can see them going down some road or beginning to do something. You know what's going to happen. You don't make them do the thing that they're going to do, but you know what's going to happen because you know your kids or your husband or whatever. It's the same thing with the weather. We can see black clouds on the horizon and say, you know what? It's going to rain. Our predicting the rain doesn't make it happen. It's just that we predict it and it happens. You see what I'm trying to say? Be very careful. Even though Judas fulfilled a prophecy, it does not mean that he was deprived of his free will. He freely chose to rebel against Christ, to deny Christ, to betray Christ. Now, why did Jesus even choose him to be one of the 12? Because it's a terrible thing to betray the Son of God. St. John Chrysostom says it was so that Judas would have every opportunity to change his mind. Because Jesus didn't want Judas, because he knew where Judas was headed for. He didn't want Judas to die. He didn't want Judas to commit suicide. He didn't want Judas to go to hell. Jesus loved Judas too. So he did everything in his power. That means, just think about this, Judas was with the other 11. When Jesus sent them out to preach 2 by 2, to sort of try out preaching and healing as a sort of their missionary trip, Judas healed people. He cast out demons. He did everything. He saw Jesus walking on water. He heard Jesus confirm that he's the Messiah. He saw all of the miracles, heard all of the beautiful sermons, and he still decided to betray Christ. So he couldn't say later, well, I didn't know who you were. He knew everything. He had every opportunity. And yet he chose to betray the Lord. So now, he leads the arresting party to the garden. One of the things that I think is the most remarkable and poignant is that scene in the garden where the Lord is waiting for them to show up. I cannot imagine what it took for him to sit there for hours knowing that Judas was coming. It was like superhuman for sure, because who among us would stay there knowing that somebody was going to come and was going to arrest you and put you to death? Because even if we know or suspect that something bad is going to happen, we always think, well, maybe it won't, turn out so bad. We have some hope. Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen. And yet he stayed there and he waited. And of course, he was in great agony, the scriptures say, so much so that he sweat blood. So he was sweating profusely, and it even came out as bloody sweat, which I describe in the book. And they finally come and they arrest him. And they take him to Caiaphas' house, where he's put on trial in the middle of the night. So first of all, we have a trial in the middle of the night in somebody's house. It's not looking good for you if you put on trial in the middle of the night in secret. We know what's going to happen. So who is there? The great Sanhedrin. That was the official ruling body of the Jews. These were the movers and the shakers, the powerful men of Jerusalem. Pharisees, Sadducees, chief priests, elders of the people, the most prominent, wealthy, influential men of Jerusalem made up this body of 72 called the Great Sanhedrin. There were smaller regional courts called lesser Sanhedrins that had 23 members, and then smaller little town courts with 3 judges. This is a great Sanhedrin. Only the Great Sanhedrin had the power to try the high priest, the king, and a false prophet. So, of course, they're bringing Jesus there as a false prophet. Well, what they really have in front of them is the great high priest of heaven, right? And the king of Israel himself. But he's brought before them as a false prophet. Now, in order for a trial to commence, there had to be 2 witnesses who testified to the same exact thing. Now, Matthew tells us that the whole council sought false testimony. They would be happy with true testimony, but they couldn't find it. So many false witnesses came forward. Then at last 2 came forward. Why does it say that there were many? Then at last there were 2. Well, because in order for there to be a charge, there had to be 2 witnesses that agreed on every detail. But they couldn't find 2. There was a parade of witnesses. They agreed, this guy said this, oh no, he said this, or he was wearing a blue shirt, or he was wearing a green shirt, or he was in the middle of the court of the Gentiles, oh, he was over here, it was on this day, they didn't agree. You can imagine the frustration of the Jewish leaders. So what they did, that they must have taken, it doesn't say this in the scriptures, I can picture it, and so can you. They took a couple people outside and said, okay guys, get your stories straight. Okay, figure it out, and then come in. And that's what happened. So finally they got 2 who said the following. He said, I will destroy the temple of God, and in 3 days build it up again. Both of them said exactly the same thing. Now the trial can begin. Okay? So after they say this, the same exact thing, the high priest stands up and says, do you have some answer? What have you got? Basically, what did you have to say for yourself? And Jesus doesn't answer. Now, he could have said, first of all, notice what they said. He said, I will destroy the temple. That means the building, right? Jesus didn't say that. He said to them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Jesus could easily have said, I didn't say that. I was talking about the temple of my body, which you're trying to destroy. And by the way, so the people doing the destroying in Jesus' statement are the chief priests. And the temple being destroyed is his body, whereas in the witness statement, the person doing the destroying is Jesus, and the thing being destroyed is the temple buildings. Okay? That's not right. Excuse me. So Jesus doesn't respond. Then the chief priest tries to compel him to respond, and he does this by putting him under oath. And there's a formula. And in Greek, it's the word exorkizo. I adjure you. I put you under oath. Tell us if you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now, after this, Jesus responds. Why? Because when the high priest puts you under oath and forces you to respond, if you don't respond, you're going to be considered guilty. So then you might as well respond, okay? So they didn't have a right against self-incrimination or anything like that. Instead, they had the opposite. They could be compelled to respond. So when he says, tell us if you're the Messiah. Now, why does the high priest, Caiaphas, even say that? Caiaphas, by the way, was a powerhouse. He was high priest for 18 years. Now, the high priesthood was supposed to be hereditary, was supposed to go only through a certain family, but that had ended hundreds of years before the time of Christ. And now the high priesthood was obtained by bribery. This wasn't just in the Roman era, but even under Herod the Great, and even before him, under Jewish Hasmonean kings, they chose who would be the high priest, because they knew if they wanted to control the people, they had to control the high priesthood. Caiaphas was the son-in-law of Annas. Annas had been high priest from about the year 6 to around the year 11 or 12. That's a long time before. And he had 5 sons. 4 of them became high priest. Then Caiaphas, who was his son-in-law, and then another son became high priest after Caiaphas. Caiaphas had been there 18 years. That's a very long time. So you can see that for most of the first century, while the temple stood, this one family controlled everything. That means they had massive wealth and massive political power, and they knew how to use it. So Caiaphas wants to be sure that he maintains control over the temple. And if getting rid of Jesus is what it takes, by golly, that is what's going to happen, by hook or by crook. But when they say, well, this man said, I will destroy the temple, why is Caiaphas's question, tell us if you're the Messiah? Why is that the question? Well, because there was a prophecy that when the Messiah came, he would build a new temple. And for this reason, the idea of the destruction of the temple is linked with the coming of the Messiah. So this is why he asked the question. He says, now I put you under oath, tell us if you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says what? You have said so. What does that mean? You said so. I didn't say so. Or you said so. What does it mean? Is it yes? Is it no? It's a yes. And it seems to be a characteristic way of Jesus speaking. Because remember when Jesus foretold his betrayal to all the disciples? In the Gospel of Matthew, at the Last Supper, he says, one of you will betray me. And they start asking him, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? Isn't it amazing? They trusted Jesus more than themselves. Only Peter would say, oh, it wouldn't be me. I would never do that. They're all, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? And Judas says, is it I? And he said, you said so. Now, why does Jesus say, you said so? He says this, by the way, to Pilate too. You say so or you have said so. Because by saying that, he's saying that that person has said the truth. The truth has come out of their mouth, whether they liked it or not. The high priest has just stated, in a question albeit, but nonetheless, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. You said so. In other words, it's the truth. And whether you want to recognize it or not, those words came out of your mouth. But Jesus doesn't stop there. That might have been enough, but maybe not. Because Jesus is not condemned to death for claiming to be the Messiah. Being the Messiah is not a crime, okay? There were many people who claimed to be the Messiah after the time of Christ. It's not blasphemy. Messiah and Son of God do not go together in the Jewish mind. But he adds to that, and he says, furthermore, you will see the Son of Man, Jesus, meaning himself, seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Those are images of divinity, God riding on the clouds. Sitting at the right hand of God means that you're co-ruling, means you're equal to God. This is when the high priest tears his robes in a very dramatic fashion. And guess what? It was illegal for the high priest ever to tear his robes. Even if his own parents died, he was never supposed to tear his robes. But here at the trial, he tears his robes to underscore the seriousness of what Jesus said, and says he has uttered blasphemy. What's your vote? I was supposed to let you guys vote. What do you think? But he says that. He's uttered blasphemy. What do you think? Oh, he deserves to die. Jesus knew they were going to find him guilty some way or another. He might as well say the truth. Why? For the same reason that he allowed Judas to be one of the 12, so they would be without excuse. Jesus is sentenced to death for who he is. Not for any mistake, but for who he truly is. Now, the charge is blasphemy. Why don't they just take him out? It's the middle of the night by now, and stone him in some quiet corner of Jerusalem. Why don't they take him for a long ride in the country, tie him to a bag of rocks and throw him in the sea? Why don't they just kill him? They had tried before. Sometimes they literally picked up stones in the temple, and the very first time he was preaching in Nazareth, they tried to throw him off a cliff. Why not just kill him? That's too good. That's too good for Jesus. He doesn't deserve that. He needs to be exposed as a fraud, as a false prophet. Everybody has to know he's a false prophet because people were following him. They believed in him. They loved him. I'm not so sure. I think that some people might have been turned off by the fact that he died on the cross, definitely. But others, after Pentecost, were baptized and became followers, okay? Because he had so many witnesses to all the things he said and did. But they did not want to just murder Jesus. They wanted him dead, but they wanted him publicly executed by crucifixion so that it would be clear that God has cursed him, okay? That's what a crucifixion was. It's the worst form of death. Remember when I told you about how if you're rich and popular and, respected, you're blessed by God? If you die by crucifixion, you're cursed. There was no worse form of death. So it was a way of underscoring the fact that Jesus was cursed by God. He cannot be the Messiah. Everything he said was wrong, etc. And if the Romans crucified him, then they could say, it was nothing we did, the Romans did it. Because remember, Jesus was very popular. They didn't want to be responsible for putting him to death. That way, they can push the responsibility off on the Romans. So early in the morning, they take him to Pilate. Pilate was governor of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. This is the year 33. The year Jesus died was the year 33 AD. And he was an equestrian. This means he comes from not the highest level of nobility in Rome, but the second tier. And guys on that level wanted to be on the top level of Roman society. Nothing was more important than status in Rome. Glory, status, respect, honors, etc. And you had to have money to do that. To climb up the social ladder in Rome was difficult. You needed money. So people like Pilate, who were ambitious, agreed to go serve as a governor in these faraway provinces. And a place like Judea was not easy. Now, the normal tenure for a governor was 2 years. Pilate was there for 10 years and might have stayed longer, except that he was recalled to Rome. 10 years, that's a long time. That means he's well into his 10 years by the time year 33. Okay, he has been there for 7 years. He knows these people very well. He has to work with, by the way, he's the person who appoints Caiaphas. He's the one who gets the bribe from Caiaphas. This is the reason why these governors would stay in these places, so that they could get bribes to appoint people to be tax collectors and a collector of this place and all these different positions and religious positions like high priest. You got a bribe. Now, I said that high priesthood was supposed to be for life. That had ceased hundreds of years before. High priests were appointed at least once a year. Pilate's predecessor appointed 3 different high priests per year. Okay, so he could get 3 bribes, but they could at least look forward to 1 bribe per year, right? That's how the system worked. It was against the law to receive bribes, but nonetheless, everybody knew that this was what was happening. So Pilate is getting ready for this massive festival, which is going to happen. It's now Friday morning, very, very early. And Jesus is taken by the Jewish leaders to Pilate to have him sentenced to death. Now, where is this taking place? Pilate is likely in the Antonia fortress, which is the Roman garrison on the Temple Mount. So, Caiaphas' house is in the upper city, the wealthy section of the wealthiest Jerusalem neighborhood. And then they would have walked him to the Temple Mount, also where he probably was officially condemned to death in a morning session of the Sanhedrin, because they were supposed to be meeting in this room on the Temple Mount. Then they walk him over to the corner of the Temple Mount where the Antonia fortress is. That fortress sat above the Temple Mount, above this wide courtyard called the Court of the Gentiles, where massive crowds would gather. And it was up there, this strategic spot, so that if they saw any unrest in the crowd, the soldiers could rush down and quell any disturbance within the crowd. It's very early, maybe as early as 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the morning. The Romans like to work from 6 a.m. to noon, then the rest of the day they had off. They like that. Now, it's the day before Passover. Passover is actually going to begin at sunset. And Pilate has to have the troops ready, because if the Jews were going to revolt, Passover was a very good time, likely time that they might choose to revolt. And he knows there's going to be a huge, massive crowd coming to the Temple Mount. So he's got plenty of things to do. Now this group of people come, but that he knows, by the way, very high-level delegation from the Sanhedrin, and they bring Pilate to Jesus. And they don't go in because they don't want to be defiled. Jesus is brought into the praetorium, and then Pilate goes out to meet the Jewish leaders. And he says, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they said, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have handed him over." Evildoer is not a crime. Okay? There's no such crime as, section 11, subsection C of the Penal Code, evildoer. You have to assert a specific crime. As soon as they say that, Pilate knows that there isn't a crime against Jesus. Otherwise, they would have said he killed somebody, started a rebellion, he did this or that or the other thing. No, we wouldn't have brought him if he wasn't an evildoer. You can't, this is not a crime. Now, one of the things that some scholars like to say today is that the Gospels are not honest. That the portrayal of Pilate, because Pilate is reluctant to put Jesus to death, they say that doesn't match what we know about Pilate. Pilate put a lot of people to death. All Roman governors heard a lot of cases. That was one of the main things they did as a governor. They heard civil cases, they heard criminal cases. They didn't hesitate to put people to death. But only if they were guilty. There isn't the slightest indication that Jesus is guilty. But many people today say that, oh, the church tried to make Pilate look like he was reluctant. They tried to pass the blame for Jesus' death onto the Jews and keep the Romans, so the Romans wouldn't be mad at them. That's a lot of nonsense. The Romans did not persecute Christians because the Christians blamed Rome for the death of Jesus. That's stupid. The Romans persecuted the Christians because they refused to worship the Roman gods. That's why they persecuted the Christians. They weren't saying, oh, how dare you say that our governor killed your Messiah. Are you kidding? The Romans would not have liked the portrayal of Pilate. They would want somebody who was strong and firm and put people to death, boom, boom, boom. So most people will say, well, we know that Pilate put a lot of people to death. So clearly, that's not the case here. This is not an honest portrayal of Pilate. Now, what if Pilate thought Jesus wasn't guilty of anything? Is he going to just put him to death willy-nilly? Does a normal person do this? No. So I do think that the gospel portrayal of Pilate is absolutely accurate. First of all, the first words out of their mouths show that they did not allege a crime. Pilate has to answer to his own upper authorities. He has a logbook, he has a journal, he has to say what he did that day. He has to say what crime somebody committed for him to be put to death. He has to report to his own superiors. He can't just go around killing people. Okay, as brutal as the Roman Empire was, they had their own standards. So it's nonsense to suggest that Pilate would have just easily put Jesus to death. Another thing that they like to say is that, of course, Pilate must have heard about Jesus. He must have known that Jesus was a revolutionary. Well, first of all, Pilate never heard of Jesus because he says, what accusation do you bring against this man? He never heard of him before. And people say, well, he must have heard of him. Why? Where would he see Jesus or hear about Jesus? So I just want you to think about how there are arguments that people make that seem very logical to us that are completely wrong. How would he have known about Jesus? Where was Jesus preaching? In synagogues, in houses, and in fields and other places where there were Jews. Jesus didn't go in the temple. Jesus didn't go preaching in Roman temples. He didn't go preaching in Greek villages. He didn't preach to pagans. Only the Jews knew who Jesus was. And even if they wanted to report him, what would they say? Hey, Pilate, there's this guy. He's getting a lot of crowds. Yeah? Who is he? He's a rabbi. Well, what does he say? He says to love your enemies and turn the other cheek. Don't waste my time, okay? That's what Pilate would have said. You see, the whole question about giving tribute, paying tribute to Caesar was a political trap so that they would have something to report to Pilate. They never had anything that they could say against Jesus to Pilate that he had done anything that was considered a threat to Rome. So Pilate has never heard of Jesus. So what does he say? Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. They've already done that. And then they say it's not lawful for us to put any man to death. Now he knows they're very serious. They want Jesus put to death. Now, when he comes back into the praetorium and speaks to Jesus, he asks him, are you the king of the Jews? Now the charge is political. Now the charge is treason. You see, there was no talk of king of the Jews at the Jewish trial. It was all about blasphemy, claiming to be the Son of God, the Messiah. There's nothing political about that. Now it's treason. Why? Because they know they have to have a charge, and it has to be something that carries the death penalty. They remembered, oh yeah, back then on Sunday, when he came into Jerusalem, the people were hailing him as the king. So Jesus says, do you say this of your own accord, or do others say it to you about me? Why would he say this? He wants Pilate to realize that Pilate has never heard of Jesus. Do you think that if there was someone who was encouraging rebellion against Rome, Pilate would have heard about it? Absolutely. There were a lot of people who were eager to gain political authority, power, and influence by being informants. Okay, they easily would have reported Jesus. And the Pilate says, am I a Jew? Your own people, the chief priests have brought you here. What have you done? And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. Now, when people say that Pilate would quickly and easily have put Jesus to death without giving it a second thought, first of all, I don't think any person, unless he's unbalanced, just puts people to death, even if they thought they were innocent. Secondly, Jesus is different. The people who were brought before Pilate had been involved in some kind of crimes or insurrections. Nothing like that has really been alleged for Jesus. He points out to Pilate that the first people and the only people to testify that he calls himself a king are the people outside who are accusing him. That's why he says, did somebody else tell you this, or is it just them? And Pilate realizes that it's them. They dislike Jesus. There's a personal animosity that they have against him. So, again, as people say, well, Pilate, we wouldn't hesitate to put Jesus to death. But Pilate has never met anyone like Jesus. He's standing there completely calm, self-assured. He's facing crucifixion, and he knows it. And he's not begging for his life. He's not arguing his case. He's not offering Pilate a bribe. He's not trying to find some orator who will plead his case. He's not asking for an extension so he can prepare a case to defend himself. Just perfectly calm and serene. And Pilate's having a conversation. Jesus starts talking about how he was born a king, but his kingdom is not of this world. Everybody who hears my voice bears witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate is like, I'm so busy. I don't have time for this. What is truth? Leave me alone. Goes outside and says, I find no crime in him. He hasn't done anything wrong. If Jesus were an insurrectionist, Pilate, believe me, would have heard about it. Now, what does Pilate do next? He says, you have a custom. I should release one man for you at Passover. How about if I release the king of the Jews? Oh no, not that man, not him, not him. We want Barabbas. Now, the person who suggests the prisoner release is Pilate. Why? Because he knew that this group had brought Jesus to him. He knew these men. They're a very high level of officials from the Sanhedrin. They want Jesus dead, and Pilate doesn't want to embarrass them by just finding Jesus not guilty and releasing him. That would be embarrassing to them. So he suggests the prisoner release so that they could say, well, we really found Jesus guilty, but Pilate released him on the basis of this clemency, so they could save face. Pilate's being very sensitive to the fact that it would be embarrassing to them if he just releases Jesus outright. So they asked for Barabbas. That's the last person Pilate would want to release. Barabbas really was a killer. He really was a criminal. So what does Pilate do? It tells us after this, he takes Jesus and has him scourged. This was, next to crucifixion itself, one of the most painful punishments that existed. It was not a simple whipping like you sometimes see in the movies, but a whip that branched off into several strands. At the end of each strand was a little metal tip. So when it was thrown on somebody's back, it would latch into their flesh, and when it was yanked out, would pull out a piece of flesh. So Jesus got a scourging. or sometimes called a flogging. It was extremely severe. And by the way, that number 39, that's a Jewish number. That's the Jewish law, 39 lashes. The Romans didn't have a limit. They knew how much they could whip somebody or scourge them without them dying. They didn't want somebody to die before crucifixion. Scourging always was done before a crucifixion. In this case, Pilate has just said he doesn't think Jesus is guilty of anything, so why does he scourge him? And he hasn't pronounced him guilty. He's hoping to pacify the Jewish leaders by punishing Jesus. Scourging is terrible, but crucifixion is worse. So Pilate's actually hoping to save Jesus' life by the scourging. Okay? After the scourging and the mocking with the purple robe, etc., he brings Jesus forward and says, you see, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may see, let me know, I find no crime in him. Now here Jesus comes out with a crown of thorns and the robe and the purple robe, and he's dripping blood. He's been injured from his head down to his feet with the flagellum. And Pilate says, behold the man. Look at him. Jesus extremely severely injured, full of blood, and he hoped that that would be enough. Just look at him. Isn't that enough for you? But it's not. When they see Jesus like this, they're determined even more so to put him to death, and they shout, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate is disgusted. He says, take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no crime in him. And the Jews say to him, we have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. Now Pilate is even more afraid. He comes in, goes back and speaks to Jesus in the praetorium and says, where are you from? Jesus doesn't answer. Remember, he never met anybody like Jesus before. He never met somebody who wasn't afraid of him, wasn't begging for his life, wasn't offering a bribe or something to get away from being crucified. Now Pilate is completely unnerved because he may have just scourged a god. Jesus doesn't answer. Now Pilate gets angry because he's not used to somebody being disrespectful. He says, you're not answering me? I mean, can't you see I'm trying to help you? You're not answering me? Don't you know I have the power to release you or to have you crucified? What does Jesus say? You would have no power if it hadn't been given to you from above. Now Pilate really unnerved. Now, this is the part where people, you see, they say, oh, this didn't happen. This wouldn't have happened. Pilate wouldn't have hesitated. Yes, he would. Why? Because Greek and Roman mythology was full of stories of gods coming to earth and looking like ordinary people and walking around among the people. And then if people disrespected them or treated them badly, the people who did that suffered a terrible fate. Don't think that Pilate wasn't thinking that. That's exactly what he was thinking. There's all kinds of mythologies. There were Roman stories and Roman plays about exactly this type of thing. Now, Pilate's convinced Jesus really might actually be a god, and he's just scourged him, and he's worried. He doesn't want to crucify him. So Pilate still seeks to release him. But the Jews say something, and this is what changes everything. The Jewish leaders say, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king sets himself against Caesar. Now, first of all, let's talk about the crowd that's outside the Antonia fortress that is calling for Jesus' crucifixion. Because when they shout for Barabbas, he says, well, what am I supposed to do with Jesus? Because just because Barabbas is released doesn't mean Jesus has to be crucified. They said, crucify him, crucify. Well, why? What has he done? Crucify him, crucify him. And the whole point of the prisoner release was to kind of calm the crowd down. Now they're getting more excited, insisting on Jesus' crucifixion. Who are these people? Because you see, it's been very common for pastors and priests to say that on Sunday, the crowd shouted, "Hosanna, Son of David," when Jesus entered the city for Palm Sunday. But on Friday, they were shouting, "Crucify him," like they flipped like this. Within 5 days, first they thought he was the Messiah, and then 5 days later, they want him dead. It's not the same crowd. Who are the people who are outside the Antonia fortress early on Friday morning? It's not a place where people just hang out. This is on the Temple Mount, in the far corner of the Temple Mount. This is the day of preparation. This is the day before the actual sacrifice of the lambs is going to come in a few hours. Who's there? Who's there to shout for Barabbas? Well, we're on the Temple Mount. Who is running this show? Who is it that's orchestrating the death of Jesus? The chief priests. They know what's going on. Who else knows? All the disciples know is that Jesus was arrested. They don't really know where he is, do they? They don't go home and to gather all their friends up to the Temple Mount to shout. They don't even know about Barabbas and the prisoner release and the possibility that Jesus could be released. The chief priests go to the temple, they get their friends, their buddies, their associates, and they tell them to come back to the Antonia fortress, which is just a few hundred yards away, to come there and shout for Barabbas. That's how that happens. It's not that the people, all the Jewish people, suddenly changed and were against Jesus. That's ridiculous. They still loved him. As he's walking to Golgotha with his cross, people are shocked. They had no idea. This is the first they've heard of it. That's, Friday, late morning or whatnot. So Pilate wants to release Jesus, but the Jews say this: if you release him, you're not a friend of Caesar. And it says, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, in Hebrew Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation, about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." His statement is laden with sarcasm. Pilate is furious. Why? They are blackmailing him. He doesn't believe Jesus is guilty of any crime. And worse, he thinks Jesus might actually be a god. How is it that this little statement of theirs, if you don't put him to death, you're not a friend of Caesar, why does that make the difference? Why is it that immediately upon hearing this, he goes up to the judgment seat and is ready to pronounce Jesus guilty? Because a year or so prior, there had been a man in Rome, very powerful, an advisor of Tiberius Caesar. He was found guilty of treason, and he and all of his associates, who had been called friends of Caesar, were put to death. Do you think that Caiaphas and the chief priests knew about this? Absolutely. And now they used that juicy bit of information. What they're saying to Pilate is this: if you don't put him to death, we're going to tell Tiberius, who just executed his best friend, on a charge or a suspicion of treason. You don't even have to prove it. All you have to do is be suspected of treason. So maybe Jesus will live today, but you, my friend, we're going to tell Tiberius all about you. You will be recalled to Rome. You will be put to death. They'll send another governor here to this area, and we'll make sure Jesus gets put to death by that guy. Don't worry, it's not over. But we will have the last say. Pilate knows that it's either Jesus or him, because they will report him to Tiberius. They will tell Tiberius, we brought a man who claimed to be a king, to Pilate, and he refused to put him to death. You see? So they've worked their hand very well, and Pilate's in a corner. And he's furious because he suggested the prisoner exchange to make it easier for them, to save them from the embarrassment of releasing Jesus outright. They don't care at all about him. Now they're manipulating the situation so that they're going to be victorious. He is being forced to do something he does not want to do. So Jesus is standing there, and he is furious, and he says, "Behold your king." What do they say? Away with him, crucify him." Pilate says sarcastically, "You want me to crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar." That's blasphemy. They accused Jesus of blasphemy, but by recognizing Caesar as their only king, not God, they have committed blasphemy. And Pilate hands Jesus over to them to be crucified. Now, the last thing Pilate needs to do is make out the titulus. That's the placard that went above the cross that stated the crime. And what does it say? Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. They objected. "Oh, no, don't say that," because it was embarrassing for them to say that this is the King of the Jews and he's being crucified. He says, "What I have written, I have written." That was his last measure of revenge against them because they forced him to do something that he did not want to do. At any rate, we have to stop at this point. It's time for lunch. When we return, we will talk about some of the most famous and amazing prophecies that were fulfilled by the crucifixion of Christ, okay?